In the last week of September, a trail camera mounted on a fence post along a creek drainage in Lynn County, Kansas, captured an image that nobody in the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks was expecting to see. It was a black bear, a female, based on subsequent analysis of the image, and she was not alone. Moving behind her in the frame, partially obscured by the tall grass at the edge of the drainage, were two cubs. They were small enough that biologists who reviewed the footage estimated they had been born that same winter, which would make them approximately 8 months old at the time of capture. The image was clear. It was dated. It was independently verified by 2 separate wildlife biologists before it was made public. And when it was, the question that immediately followed was not whether the image was real. The question was how, exactly, a black bear sow with dependent cubs from the current year's cohort had arrived in Lynn County, Kansas, which sits in the eastern part of the state, just above the Missouri border, a county that has not had a confirmed resident black bear population in recorded wildlife management history, and which is separated from the nearest established black bear population by a stretch of landscape that, by any conventional analysis of black bear dispersal biology, a female with cubs should not have crossed. That question does not have a clean answer. It may not have an answer at all, at least not yet. What it has is a set of partial explanations that each account for some portion of the puzzle, and none of which accounts for the whole thing. And the space between what those partial explanations can explain and what actually happened is where something genuinely interesting is sitting. Something about the way bear range expansion works, about the biology of dispersal, about the limits of what wildlife managers thought they understood about where black bears can and cannot go, and why, and about what a single trail camera image in a creek drainage in eastern Kansas might be telling us about a much larger process that is happening quietly across the interior of the continent, with almost no public awareness and very little systematic study. If you want to follow stories like this one, stories that sit at the edge of what wildlife science currently understands and that don't resolve into easy answers, stick around. There is a lot more to get into here. The baseline fact first, because it matters, and because it is the thing most of the initial coverage of this sighting got wrong by either understating or overstating it in ways that served a particular narrative. Black bears are not unknown in Kansas. They are not a species for which a Kansas sighting is automatically a biological impossibility or a conservation miracle. Individual black bears, almost always young males in the dispersal phase of their life history, have been documented in Kansas with increasing frequency over the past 2 decades. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks maintains a sighting database that shows a clear upward trend in confirmed and credible bear observations, going back to roughly 2003. The bears in those records are overwhelmingly single animals, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly in the eastern third of the state, and overwhelmingly in transit, meaning they were observed once and not again, which is the behavioral signature of a dispersing animal moving through unfamiliar terrain without establishing residency. None of that is surprising. It is exactly what you would predict from first principles if you knew what was happening to the black bear population in the adjacent states to the east and south. Missouri has a black bear population. It is not large, but it has been growing. The Missouri Department of Conservation has been tracking it for years and has documented a slow but consistent westward expansion of the range from the core population centered in the Ozark Highlands in the southern part of the state. Arkansas has a substantial black bear population, one of the largest in any state east of the Rockies, centered in the Ozarks and the Ouachita Mountains, and producing a significant annual dispersal of young males that move outward from the core in all directions, including north and west, into Missouri and Oklahoma. Oklahoma's black bear population is less well documented, but is present in the southeastern corner of the state, and is connected to the Arkansas population by continuous forest habitat. The result of these three adjacent source populations is a gradient of bear presence that diminishes as you move north and west from the Ozark-Ouachita core, but does not drop to zero at any clean boundary. Bears from these populations show up in places that wildlife managers describe as unexpected on a regular basis, specifically young males following river corridors and timbered drainages into terrain that looks, on a landscape map, like it should not support bears, but that in practice provides enough cover and enough food resources to move through. All of that context explains the young male dispersers that have been showing up in Kansas. It does not explain what was on that trail camera in Lynn County. A female with cubs is not a disperser. She is not a young animal making a single exploratory pass through unfamiliar terrain and then either dying or eventually finding her way back to established range. She is an adult, reproductively active female who has set up a home range somewhere, raised a litter through the winter, and is now moving with those cubs in what should be, by every piece of conventional wisdom in black bear biology, the most strongly philopatric phase of a female black bear's life. Females with dependent young do not make long-distance movements. That is not a soft generalization. It is one of the most consistent and well-documented findings in decades of black bear research across North America. They maintain small, stable home ranges, centered on the area where they denned. They avoid unfamiliar terrain because unfamiliar terrain is terrain they cannot assess for predation risk to their cubs, for food resources, for den sites, for the full suite of habitat requirements that a female with dependents needs to manage. The behavioral ecology of female black bears with young cubs is built around stability, not movement. So, when a trail camera shows a sow with cubs in Lynn County, Kansas, the first and most basic question it raises is not where she came from, although that is also a genuinely interesting question. The first question it raises is where she is going, or more precisely, where she already was. Because a female with cubs that young was somewhere specific 6 months earlier when she denned, and she was somewhere specific in the spring when the cubs emerged, and she has been somewhere specific through the summer as those cubs grew large enough to follow her at the pace at which that trail camera image shows her moving. None of those places are Lynn County, Kansas, because if they were, there would have been trail camera images before September. There would have been sightings. There would have been incidents. A sow with cubs in a new area is not a subtle presence. She produces sign. She activates cameras. She raids corn feeders and beehives and fruit trees. She leaves tracks in creek mud. She is, in the vocabulary of wildlife monitoring, a detectable animal. And nothing corresponding to a resident sow with cubs had been detected in Lynn County or the surrounding counties before that September image, which means she moved there. And the question of where she came from and what route she took is the question that nobody, as of the time this is being written, has been able to answer in a way that fully satisfies the constraints of what we know about how bears move. The geographic context deserves to be laid out carefully because it is the foundation of what makes this case unusual. Lynn County is in the eastern tier of counties in Kansas, sharing its eastern border with Missouri. That border matters, but perhaps less than you might think, because the Missouri bear population, that would be the most logical source for any eastward-moving bear, is not in western Missouri. It is in the Ozarks, in the southern part of the state, in the counties that border Arkansas and that represent the northwestern extension of the Ozark Highlands ecosystem. The distance from the core of the Missouri bear population in the Mark Twain National Forest region to Lynn County, Kansas, is roughly 200 miles of mostly agricultural landscape, specifically the intensively farmed river valley and upland plain of western Missouri and eastern Kansas, with the Missouri and Osage rivers as major features of that landscape and the Marais des Cygnes River drainage as the most prominent watercourse running through Lynn County itself. 200 miles is not, in principle, beyond the documented dispersal capability of black bears. Young males have been documented covering distances of 100 miles, 150 miles, even occasionally 200 miles or more in dispersal movements. Those records exist, but they are records for males. For animals whose entire behavioral program during the dispersal phase is oriented toward covering ground. The documented record for female black bears shows something categorically different. Natal dispersal by females, meaning the movement of a young female away from her birth range to establish a new home range, typically covers distances in the range of 5 to 15 miles, occasionally 30 miles, occasionally more, but rarely and in specific circumstances. Adult females with established home ranges move even less. The idea that an adult female with cubs crossed 200 miles of heavily agricultural, largely forested only along riparian corridors, Midwestern landscape is not something that fits neatly into any existing framework for female black bear movement ecology. It is the thing that makes this case genuinely puzzling, rather than simply interesting. The riparian corridor question is central to any attempt to explain the route, and it is where the most serious work is currently happening, among the handful of researchers who have been looking at this. The Marais des Cygnes River watershed, which drains much of eastern Kansas and western Missouri before joining the Osage River in Missouri, represents exactly the kind of landscape feature that large mammals use to move across otherwise inhospitable terrain. River corridors provide cover. They provide food resources in the form of riparian vegetation, mass-producing trees where those trees are present, small mammals, and aquatic food resources that bears exploit opportunistically. They provide connectivity between fragments of suitable habitat that would otherwise be isolated in a matrix of row crop agriculture. Bears, like most large mammals that move through agricultural landscapes, are not moving randomly across the open fields. They are moving along the linear features, the creek drainages, the shelter belts, the fence rows with heavy vegetation, the timber corridors along rivers that provide the cover and the travel routes that allow an animal to move through terrain that is otherwise exposed and therefore energetically and behaviorally costly to traverse. The Marais des Cygnes corridor runs from Lynn County westward and connects, through tributary drainages, to the broader Missouri River watershed to the north and to the Osage River system to the east. If you were going to hypothesize a route by which a bear from the Missouri Ozarks could reach Lynn County, Kansas, the Marais des Cygnes and its tributaries represent the most plausible pathway. The corridor is not continuous forest. Nothing in eastern Kansas or western Missouri is. But it is a corridor of riparian vegetation and timbered drainage that, at sufficient resolution, provides the connectivity that makes large-scale movement possible for an animal that moves primarily at night and that does not require large blocks of unbroken forest to travel through, even if it does require them to persist as a resident over time. The wildlife biologists who have been working on this case have been spending considerable time with satellite imagery of the watershed, trying to trace a route from the known Missouri Bear Range to the Lynn County camera site. And what they have found is that the corridor exists in the sense that it is not an absolute barrier, but that it requires the bear to have moved through a series of choke points, narrow sections of cover separated by open agricultural land, that would have exposed her and her cubs to detection and to significant physiological cost. It is possible. It is not easy to square with what the literature says about how adult females move. The alternative explanation, and it is one that several researchers have raised, but that nobody has fully committed to because the data needed to support it does not currently exist, is that the bear was not coming from the Missouri Ozarks at all. The alternative explanation is that she has been in eastern Kansas for longer than the September trail camera image suggests, that she denned in the region, that she is part of a small, undocumented resident population that has established itself in the riparian corridors of eastern Kansas without generating the density of detections that would normally bring it to the attention of wildlife managers. This is a less exotic explanation than the long-distance movement hypothesis. Small populations of large mammals can be surprisingly cryptic in landscapes that are not intensively monitored. The white-tailed deer population in Kansas, which is now enormous, was historically absent from much of the state and re-established itself largely without formal reintroduction, spreading through riparian corridors in a pattern that was only comprehensively documented after the fact. The possibility that a small number of black bears, including some females, have been quietly establishing themselves in the riparian systems of eastern Kansas over the past decade or two, reproducing at low density, using the Marais des Cygnes and its tributaries as core habitat without generating a critical mass of detections, is not biologically absurd. It is, in fact, the kind of thing that has happened repeatedly with expanding large mammal populations across the continent. But the undocumented resident population hypothesis has its own problems. Chief among them is the monitoring gap it requires you to accept. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks runs a robust sighting reporting program. The eastern counties of the state have a significant human population density relative to the western plains, and a culture of outdoor recreation and wildlife observation that produces a substantial volume of reported wildlife sightings. Trail cameras are ubiquitous in eastern Kansas, deployed by hunters, farmers, and landowners in numbers that have increased dramatically with the drop in camera prices over the past decade. The idea that a resident population of black bears, even a very small one, has been present in eastern Kansas for multiple years and has gone essentially undetected is harder to maintain as an explanation the more carefully you look at the monitoring landscape. It is possible. Small populations of secretive animals do get missed, especially if they are confined to riparian habitats that are private land and that are not systematically monitored by wildlife agencies. But it requires accepting a monitoring failure of a scale that wildlife managers are reluctant to claim. Most of them, when pressed, will tell you that they think they would have known, that the sighting database would have shown earlier detections, that the absence of prior observations in eastern Kansas is real and informative rather than a gap in surveillance. If that judgment is right, then the bear came from somewhere, and the long-distance movement hypothesis, uncomfortable as it is with the existing literature on female black bear movements, is the one you are left with. There is a third possibility, the one that is mentioned least often in formal discussions of this case, perhaps because it is the hardest to operationalize and the most uncomfortable for wildlife managers to contemplate. The third possibility is that the bear's route is explainable, but that the explanation requires a revision in our understanding of female black bear movement capability under specific conditions. The conditions, in this framing, matter enormously. A female black bear making a movement that looks anomalous by the standards of the existing literature is not necessarily behaving in a way that is biologically impossible. She may be behaving in a way that the existing literature, which was built largely from studies of bears in established range with adequate habitat, did not capture because the conditions that would produce it were not present in the study populations at the time the literature was developed. Range-edge bears, animals at the geographic frontier of the species' expanding distribution, may behave differently from bears in core range. They may be capable of, or driven to, movements that look extreme by the standards established in studies of interior populations. The dispersal of a population across a novel landscape may require, and may select for, a behavioral flexibility in females that the existing literature underestimates because the existing literature is not primarily drawn from observations of expanding range fronts. This is not a new idea in behavioral ecology. The phenomenon of range-edge behavioral change has been documented in multiple species. Coyotes, to take the most instructive example, showed behavioral characteristics in their eastern expansion that biologists trained on western coyote populations found genuinely surprising. Their diet, their social structure, their territory sizes, their movement patterns in the new terrain all differed from the western baseline in ways that reflected the specific ecological context of the eastern expansion, rather than representing anomalies or errors. The eastern coyote is not a different animal genetically, at least not substantially, but it behaves in ways that would have looked incorrect and unlikely to a biologist consulting only the Western literature. If black bears are doing something analogous at the edge of their current expansion into the agricultural Midwest, if the females at the range frontier are capable of movements that interior females are not, the Lynn County sow might not be an anomaly at all. She might be the leading example of a phenomenon that is real and recurrent, but that we do not yet have enough cases to characterize. The implications of each of these explanations, if any of them turns out to be correct, are different, and in some cases, quite significant. If the bear came from the Missouri Ozarks via the Marais des Cygnes corridor, it means the corridor is functional for female bears in a way that nobody predicted, and that the riparian systems of eastern Kansas are more capable of supporting long-distance bear movement than the current management framework acknowledges. That has implications for how wildlife managers in Kansas think about bear presence going forward, about the infrastructure of road crossings and bridge underpasses and culverts along those corridors, about the monitoring programs that would need to be deployed to track a corridor-using population, about the potential for Lynn County and adjacent counties to become a regular part of the dispersal landscape for the Missouri and Arkansas bear populations. If there is already a small resident population that has been undocumented, the implications are more immediate and more operationally pressing, because a resident population means a management responsibility, means a set of human-bear coexistence questions about livestock, beehives, bird feeders, corn crops, and eventually public safety that Kansas wildlife managers have not had to address at any scale before, and for which the institutional capacity is not currently in place. And if the range-edge behavioral flexibility explanation is right, the implications are the broadest of the three, because they suggest that the models wildlife managers use to predict the trajectory of black bear range expansion across the agricultural Midwest need to be substantially revised, that the expansion may be faster, more driven by female movement, and less constrained by landscape barriers than the current models assume. The specific configuration of eastern Kansas as a potential bear landscape is worth examining in some detail, because it is not an obvious candidate for black bear colonization, and because the features that make it an unlikely candidate are also the features that determine whether any resident population that may be establishing itself there can persist. Black bears require three things at the landscape scale to maintain viable populations. They need denning habitat, specifically areas with topographic and vegetative complexity sufficient to support maternal dens with adequate insulation and security. They need food resources that can support the caloric demands of a large omnivore across a seasonal diet that shifts from spring green-up foraging to summer berry and insect exploitation, to fall hyperphagia on mast, particularly hard mast from oaks and soft mast from wild fruits. And they need security from human persecution, both formal in the sense of hunting pressure and informal in the sense of tolerance for bears as a presence on working agricultural land. Eastern Kansas has variable amounts of all three, which is to say, it is not ideal, but it is not categorically unsuitable either. The Osage-Cuestas region of eastern Kansas, which includes Lynn County and several surrounding counties, is a landscape of gentle ridges and creek valleys where the rock geology produces poor soils that kept much of the terrain in timber rather than converting entirely to row crops. The timbered creek drainages in this region, particularly along the Marais des Cygnes and its major tributaries include patches of mature bottomland forest with significant oak components. The oak component is critical. Hard mast from oaks is the primary driver of fall hyperphagia in black bear populations across the eastern part of the species range, and its presence or absence in a landscape is one of the strongest predictors of whether bears can achieve the fat accumulation necessary to successfully den and reproduce. The eastern Kansas riparian system has it. Not abundantly, not in the unbroken blocks that characterize the best bear habitat in the Ozarks or the Appalachians, but in the fragmented, corridor-associated form that bears in an expanding population at a range edge may be learning to exploit in ways that bears in well-established range have not been forced to. The denning question is less well resolved. Eastern Kansas is not topographically rugged. Hillside den sites, which are the most commonly used by bears in the eastern United States, exist along creek bluffs and valley walls, but are not abundant. Ground dens, which are used by bears in less topographically complex terrain and which require thick brush cover rather than specific rock or slope configurations, are more likely what a bear in eastern Kansas would use. Ground dens are less secure and less thermally buffered than hillside dens, which may affect cub survival rates. But they are used successfully across a broad range of bear populations in eastern states, including in Missouri, where the terrain is only modestly more complex than eastern Kansas in the areas of the Missouri Ozarks closest to the Kansas border. The denning question is not a deal-breaker for bear persistence in eastern Kansas. It is a constraint that would affect population viability at the margins, rather than preventing establishment altogether. The human tolerance question is in some ways the most uncertain and the most important. Kansas has no history of black bears as a management species. There is no hunting season, no permitting system, no established protocol for human-bear conflict. Livestock producers in eastern Kansas have not been operating in a landscape that included bear depredation risk as a factor in their planning. The social infrastructure for coexistence with bears, the conflict resolution protocols, the compensation programs for livestock losses, the public education framework, none of it exists in Kansas in the way it exists in states that have been managing bears as resident species for decades. What does exist, based on the response to this particular sighting and to previous individual bear sightings in eastern Kansas, is a general public attitude toward bears that runs from curious to enthusiastic, which is not surprising given that most Kansans have never had a bear-related livestock loss and have no specific economic grievance against the species. Public enthusiasm for bears tends to decline as the human-bear conflict rate increases. The question of whether it would hold through the livestock losses and beehive raids and close encounter incidents that would accompany a genuinely establishing bear population is not answered by the current data. The wildlife management response to this sighting has been careful and in some ways deliberately understated, which is itself informative. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks confirmed the sighting, confirmed the identification of the animals, and issued a public notice reminding residents of the standard bear encounter protocols, including securing attractants, not approaching bears, and reporting sightings. What the department did not do was launch a formal investigation into the bear's origin, which would require capture and genetic sampling to determine whether the animal is genetically associated with the Missouri or Arkansas populations. That investigation would be useful. It has not been authorized as of the time this information was compiled, and the stated reason that the department is monitoring the situation before committing to an active management response is understandable from an agency resources standpoint, but means that the most direct source of information about where the bear came from and what it represents is not currently being collected. The genetic sampling question is worth dwelling on because it represents the clearest path to resolving the origin question, and because it is also the path that has been most directly not taken. for reasons that are partly resource-related and partly political in a wildlife management sense. If the bear could be captured and sampled, the resulting genetic profile could be compared against the reference databases for the Missouri and Arkansas bear populations, which are reasonably well characterized from prior research. A genetic match to a specific subpopulation would tell you, with high confidence, where the animal came from. A lack of match to either established population would be the most interesting result of all, because it would suggest either a source population that has not been genetically characterized, meaning a population segment of unknown distribution, or a degree of genetic distinctiveness that would be consistent with a small, partially isolated population that has been developing in the region for long enough to show some degree of differentiation. Neither outcome is definitive proof of any specific hypothesis, but either would substantially narrow the field of possibilities in a way that the current absence of genetic data does not allow. The difficulty of capturing the bear is real, not just procedural. A sow with cubs is an extremely wary animal. She is difficult to trap. She tends to avoid the baited culvert traps that are the standard tool for bear capture in the East, and the terrain she is using, riparian corridor with heavy vegetation and abundant escape cover, is not the kind of terrain that makes trapping efficient. Darting from helicopter or from a vehicle is possible, but requires locating the animal, which has not been definitively accomplished since the September camera image. She may still be in Lynn County. She may have moved. She may have already denned for the winter, in which case any attempt to locate her would require the kind of intensive search effort that the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, with its existing resource allocation, is not positioned to mount. The practical obstacles to sampling her are genuine. They are also, if you are a biologist who understands what this animal might represent, genuinely frustrating. The broader question this case opens up is about the trajectory of black bear range expansion across the agricultural Midwest and what it means for a region that has not historically thought of itself as bear country. The black bear's range in North America has been contracting and expanding in response to human land use and hunting pressure for centuries. But the pattern of the past half-century is particularly important to understand because it contains the context for what is happening now. By the mid-20th century, black bears had been eliminated from much of their historical range in the eastern United States and across virtually all of the agricultural interior of the continent. The populations that remained were largely confined to mountainous terrain in the Appalachians, the Ozarks, the Ouachitas, and the isolated mountain ranges of the Rockies and the Pacific Ranges, areas that had not been substantially converted to agriculture and that had maintained enough forest cover to support bears through the period of maximum hunting pressure. The combination of reduced hunting pressure through regulated seasons and formal protection in many jurisdictions, reforestation of agricultural land that had been abandoned in the mid-century farm consolidation, and changes in wildlife management philosophy that progressively shifted bears from varmints to game animals with attendant management infrastructure, produced a recovery in black bear populations across the eastern United States that has been one of the genuinely remarkable wildlife stories. The recovery has not been uniform. It has been fastest and most complete in the states where the core Appalachian and Ozark Ouachita populations had the most to build on, and it has spread outward from those cores in a pattern that reflects the interaction between bear dispersal behavior, habitat connectivity, and human tolerance. The westward spread of the Missouri population is one of several such expansion fronts currently active. In the Ozarks of northern Arkansas and southern Missouri, the bear population has been growing for decades and is now producing a surplus of dispersing animals that is being expressed as a series of range extensions in multiple directions. North, through central Missouri, toward the Missouri River. West, through the Arkansas River Valley, into eastern Oklahoma. Northwest, into the Cherokee and Ouachita Highlands of eastern Oklahoma. And, apparently further northwest, into Kansas, by whatever route this particular animal took. The question of whether this expansion can continue through eastern Kansas into the broader Great Plains ecosystem is one that conservation biologists find fascinating, and that wildlife managers find somewhat more complicated, for the straightforward reason that expansion implies management responsibility, and management responsibility requires resources and institutional capacity that do not currently exist in states that have not managed bears as resident species. The theoretical habitat capacity of eastern Kansas is not zero. The Flint Hills, the Osage Cuestas, the riparian corridors of the eastern tier all have characteristics that bears can exploit at some level of productivity. A Kansas bear population would never look like a Pennsylvania or a California bear population. The habitat is not structurally similar, and the mast resource in particular is nowhere near as abundant. But the documented reality of range expansion in species like white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, and coyotes, all of which successfully colonized the agricultural Midwest over the past century in ways that earlier assessments would have suggested were unlikely, argues for caution about declaring any particular landscape categorically unsuitable. The Marais des Cygnes corridor, if it turns out to function as a bear movement corridor in the way the Linn County sighting might suggest, is a specific landscape feature whose conservation value in this context is potentially significant and currently not recognized in any formal management framework. The river and its riparian zone cross from Missouri into Kansas and run through the eastern Osage Cuestas region before joining the Osage River system. It is a working landscape, with agricultural land on both sides in most sections, timber in the immediate riparian zone, and a mix of private ownership and public land, including the Marais des Cygnes National Wildlife Refuge, which lies in both Kansas and Missouri and represents the most significant block of public conservation land along the corridor's Kansas reach. The refuge was established primarily for waterfowl and migratory birds, not for large mammals, and its management orientation reflects that. But it provides exactly the kind of secure, low-disturbance riparian habitat that bears would use both for transit and for residence. And its existence in the middle of the corridor may be one of the reasons that bears moving through this system survive to be detected in Linn County rather than being detected as roadkills on the roads crossing the corridor on either side. The road mortality dimension of bear range expansion is one of the most consistently underappreciated factors in evaluating whether a dispersing population can establish itself in a new area. Bears moving through novel terrain face road crossings that they have not learned to navigate, and that they cross at night, often at speeds and trajectories that do not match the culverts and bridges that might otherwise allow safe crossing. The roadkill record for black bears in Missouri shows a distinct concentration along the western edge of the established range and in the corridors that dispersing animals are using to move north and west, which tells you something about where movement is occurring, but also about the mortality cost that movement imposes. In Kansas, the roadkill record for bears is essentially non-existent, which is consistent with either very few bears moving through the state or very few bears being identified as such when they are struck. Road-killed bears are not commonly detected in states where bears are not expected, because the observer who finds an unidentified carcass does not think bear. They think large dog, or possibly some other explanation that does not involve an animal whose presence in that county is officially unexpected. The absence of roadkill data in Kansas is not strong evidence that bears are not moving through it. It may simply be evidence of identification failure in an area where nobody is looking for bears. The camera trapping effort that produced the September image is itself a product of a monitoring approach that is increasingly important in wildlife management, and that is beginning to change the pace at which range expansions are detected and characterized. Trail cameras deployed by hunters and landowners represent a distributed monitoring network of extraordinary density in the eastern United States. The cameras are not managed by wildlife agencies. They are not positioned based on systematic sampling designs, and the data they produce is not centrally collected or analyzed. But in aggregate, they cover terrain that would never be systematically monitored with any level of official agency effort, and they produce detections that official monitoring programs would miss entirely. The Linn County image came from a private landowner's camera, not from a wildlife agency monitoring program. It was shared with the department after the landowner recognized that what the camera had captured was unusual and warranted official attention. This is the model by which most bear detections in the expanding range are happening. Citizen monitoring feeding into an official awareness system that could not generate the detections itself, and it is a model whose value increases as the expansion front moves into terrain where official attention is thin. The cubs in the image are worth specific attention because they are the most biologically significant element of what was captured. Adult males, moving through Kansas, are interesting, but they represent single animals, making potentially one-time movements without establishment implications. A sow with cubs represents a reproductive event. It means that somewhere in the system, whether in eastern Kansas, western Missouri, or somewhere along the route between them, a female bear successfully denned, successfully birthed, and has been successfully raising cubs through the current year, which requires not just the presence of the animal in a landscape, but the presence of adequate habitat to support the entire reproductive sequence. The existence of the cubs is the strongest single piece of evidence in favor of some form of resident or semi-resident presence, whether of this individual female or of a small population she is part of, because it represents a biological commitment to place that a dispersing individual does not make. Even if she was only in eastern Kansas for the months immediately preceding the September image, she was somewhere else for the earlier parts of the reproductive cycle, and that somewhere else is, in the language of wildlife management, de facto bear habitat that has been functioning as such without official recognition. The conservation implications of the Linn County sighting exist on multiple scales simultaneously, which is part of what makes it a genuinely interesting case rather than simply a good trail camera story. At the local scale, it raises immediate questions about how Linn County and surrounding eastern Kansas counties should be thinking about bears, whether landowners and livestock producers should be adjusting their practices, whether the hunting community's interest in bears as a potential game species should be part of the conservation conversation, whether the counties along the Marais des Cygnes corridor are going to see more sightings in coming years and need to have institutional readiness that they currently do not have. At the state scale, it raises questions about whether Kansas wildlife management needs to add black bears to its species of concern framework, whether monitoring programs should be formalized, whether the riparian corridor should be flagged as a conservation priority for reasons beyond its existing value for waterbirds and waterfowl. At the regional scale, it is a data point in the larger story of black bear expansion across the Midwest, a data point that suggests the expansion may be moving further and faster than current models predict, and that the corridor-based dispersal mechanism is more capable than the literature on female bear movements would suggest. And, at the broadest scale of all, it is a case study in the limits of what wildlife science currently understands about how species expand their ranges through novel landscapes, about what features of behavior and ecology we have characterized correctly, and what features we have gotten wrong because the conditions that would reveal our errors did not exist until now. The animals themselves, the female and her two cubs moving through the Marais des Cygnes drainage in the September image, are not making any of these calculations. They are doing what bears do. They are moving through available habitat, exploiting available food, finding cover when they need it, avoiding the things that need to be avoided. The female's behavior is not anomalous from her perspective. She is not aware that she has crossed a line on a management map or exceeded a parameter in a dispersal model. She is following the same biological programming that black bears have been following for hundreds of thousands of years, which is to find the food and the cover and the security that reproductive success requires, and to move toward it when it is available and away from conditions that threaten it. The landscape she is moving through is different from the landscape that her ancestors occupied, but bears are flexible enough, behaviorally and dietarily, that the difference has not been a categorical barrier. It has been a gradient of difficulty that individual animals, with specific characteristics, behavioral flexibility, low neophobia, tolerance for agricultural matrices, willingness to make longer movements in search of sufficient resources, have been able to overcome on a case-by-case basis. The Linn County sow, whoever she is and wherever she came from, is one of those individuals. She navigated something that the biology says should have been very hard. She did it successfully enough to be in eastern Kansas in September with 2 healthy cubs. The route she took remains unknown. The place she denned last winter remains unknown. The genetic population she came from remains unknown. The size of whatever community of bears she may be part of remains unknown. All of that unknown is, depending on your perspective, either a gap in knowledge that wildlife management urgency should be filling, or an invitation to reconsider what the knowledge base we have built actually tells us about what bears can do in the landscapes we have given them. The answer is probably some of both. The gap needs to be filled. Camera arrays should be deployed along the Marais des Cygnes corridor from its Missouri source to its Kansas reach. Genetic sampling should be attempted if the animal or any associated individual can be located. The sighting database should be systematically reviewed for detections that might have been miscategorized or overlooked. The roadkill records in western Missouri and eastern Kansas should be audited for misidentified large mammal carcasses. These are not expensive or exotic management actions. They are the basic monitoring and documentation steps that a competent wildlife management response to an anomalous detection should include, and their absence from the current response is itself informative about the state of institutional readiness for bear expansion in the region. At the same time, the possibility that the animal is doing something genuinely beyond what the current models predict, that she is a biological anomaly in the most literal and most interesting sense, a data point that requires revision of the model rather than just filling in of its parameters, should not be dismissed in favor of the more comfortable explanation that there is a simple answer we just haven't found yet. The simple answer may exist. The corridor may be more functional than assumed. The population may be more established than detected. One of those conventional explanations may turn out to account for everything the September image shows. But the possibility that neither of them does, that what this animal has done, requires a genuine update to the way wildlife biologists think about female black bear movement at the range frontier, is real enough that it should be sitting at the table in every conversation about what this case means. The broader story of black bear recovery and range expansion in the eastern United States and agricultural Midwest is one of the quiet successes of North American wildlife management over the past half-century. It has not generated the cultural visibility of wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone or the celebrated return of mountain lions to the Black Hills. It has happened without federal intervention, without formal reintroduction programs, without the political controversy that attaches to apex predators. It has happened because bears are adaptable, because habitat conditions improved, because hunting pressure was regulated, and because in most of the places where bears have returned, the humans living there found ways to accommodate them with a level of conflict that remained below the threshold that produces political demands for elimination. The expansion into the agricultural Midwest represents a new chapter of that story, one that is happening in landscapes and among human communities that have less institutional history with bears, and that will need to develop the management frameworks, the conflict resolution protocols, the social license mechanisms, largely from scratch as the expansion continues. The Lynn County sighting, one female with 2 cubs on a trail camera in a creek drainage in eastern Kansas in September, is the advance notice that this chapter has opened. It deserves to be read carefully. The route she took remains the central mystery. It is the thing that the people closest to this case return to repeatedly when the conversation moves past the immediate questions of what was confirmed and what it means at the immediate management level. A female black bear with cubs does not take a route that doesn't make sense for a female black bear with cubs. She took a route that was available to her and that worked. The fact that we cannot explain it with the models we have is not evidence that the route was impossible. It is evidence that the models are incomplete. That incompleteness is worth taking seriously, not because it changes the practical implications of a single confirmed sighting, but because it points to a limit in what wildlife management thinks it knows about how bears move through the world and what the world is becoming available to them in ways that the existing models have not yet caught up with. The sow in that trail camera image, her cubs moving behind her through the tall grass of a Lynn County creek drainage, is somewhere in eastern Kansas, or somewhere beyond it now. She has moved on since September, toward whatever the landscape ahead of her holds. The question of where she came from and how is one that the science of bear ecology is going to need to follow her to answer.